Hi everyone, I'm here on this really rainy day to do a couple of things. I want to talk to you about the books I've been reading recently, and I also want to delve a bit deeper than that and do some close reading and talk to you about those things, because many of you have been asking me to do some more dissection, close analysis, all of that. So I'm going to be doing both of those things today. For the past 2 years, I've been a vlogger in residence for the Poetry Book Society. The Poetry Book Society was set up by T.S. Eliot. They're an amazing organisation. Every season, they have a poet who picks out what they consider to be the most exciting, new, innovative poetry being published, and they send it to you in the post. So if that's of interest, I'll link all the details in the description box down below. I have a code that gets you 10% off subscription, and if you are a Poetry Book Society member, then you get 25% off all of the books on their website too. So I'm going to be talking to you about the 5 books that they picked for their autumn books this year, and as I said, I'm going to be doing some close reading. I thought I would take a poem from each book and I'll show it to you and you can pause it and have a read, and then I'm going to go through and annotate it and talk to you about them briefly, because otherwise we'd be here all day. But I just thought it'd be fun, a little bit of a change to the normal review type format that I have on here. The first collection I want to look at is this one here, which is Flesh by Mary Jean Chan. Mary Jean Chan grew up in Hong Kong and now lives in London. The title of this collection, Flesh, is really clever because this is a word in French. It's a word used in fencing, which is a rather aggressive move, but obviously it sounds exactly like the English word flesh as well. And the themes of this collection touch on flesh and the body and queerness and relationships, and also fencing and aggression and microaggressions as well. Navigating complicated conversations with family members who are not okay with you being queer, and that being in part almost like being bilingual, which the author of this book also is, and she uses Chinese characters throughout the collection in a brilliant way, in a similar way that Raymond Antrobus uses British Sign Language in his collection The Perseverance. So being bilingual, not just speaking 2 languages, but also navigating these 2 forms of language with people who know that you're queer and people who don't, or perhaps do but are not okay with it. So I thought this collection was absolutely fascinating, and the poem that I have chosen to dissect is one called Window. So here is the poem before I've annotated it, if you want to pause it and have a read. Let's pause on the title of this poem, The Window. So a window is obviously a viewing point where we can look out on the world, but it's also a space where people can look in on us. And therefore the poem itself becomes like a window as we are observing the author through it, or the narrator of the poem through it. And the shape of the poem, it's very square. It's almost like a window itself. It begins, once in a lifetime, you will gesture at an open window, tell the one who detests the queerness in you that dead daughters do not disappoint. So this alliteration here of dead daughters, detests the queerness in you that dead daughters do not disappoint, makes the words feel very heavy. They're really falling on the page. So this threat of violence as well. There's an open window. Well, maybe if you don't like me and you can't accept me, I could throw myself out of this window. And in doing so, free sore knees from the inching towards a kind of reprieve. So we're talking about religion here and faith, and how that meets and often clashes with queerness as well. And it's a reaching for things that are like but not necessarily are, so a kind of reprieve. And further down we have, is like the sun, is like love. So reaching towards things that don't feel concrete or possible at this particular time. And this poem is also in the second person, once in a lifetime you. So it's like the author is looking through a window at a younger version of themselves when they felt like this, and talking about them as if they are another person. Declare yourself genderless as a sparrow or hawk, so implying that breaking free from societal constraints, narratives, norms is freeing, is like flying, standing by this open window, looking outside, thinking, I could go out there and be myself. It goes on to say, an encumbered body let loose from its cage, you will refuse your mother's rage. And having this rhyme at the center of the poem really signifies a turning point and gives the poem power and momentum. It goes on to say that the mother's words are heavy, like the heaviest of stones. Her anger is like the sun, which is like love. So bringing together these seemingly contradictory things again. So there's flying and falling, and also queerness and faith, and also anger and love. Saying that her words are are heavy implies that they have impact, that they have weight, that maybe the narrator doesn't want to admit that the words have weight, doesn't want to admit that they really hurt, that they stay with her for a very long time, but they do because it's her mother and she loves her. You will linger, knowing that this standing before an open window is what the living do, that they sometimes reconsider at the slightest touch of grace. So looking out again at this open window, at the world out there that you could go out and be part of, and thinking not just of death, but that looking out of the window, looking out and considering the world around you and taking those moments to pause is what living people do. And you can't do that if you're dead. The next in the box this autumn is The Tradition by Jericho Brown, which follows on from his collection, The New Testament. And in here you can find poems about fatherhood, blackness, queerness, trauma, the lasting effects of trauma. And he also has invented this new way of writing poetry, which he repeats several times throughout in format, not in actual words, called the duplex, and it's an amalgamation of lots of different things. In fact, on the back it says it is a blend of the sonnet, the ghazal, and the blues, and I just thought it was it's almost a love poem in itself, two forms of poetry. So I thought that I would pick one of those duplexes in this book to talk about today. Again, I'm going to show the poem here before I've annotated it if you want to pause it and have a read. Begin again with the title of the poem. So this poem is called Duplex, and a duplex is an apartment with rooms on two connected floors, and that fits in with the themes in this poem, which are about history repeating themselves, so things on top of one another, history repeating itself, things being passed on, moved down, but also the weight of what has come before and the threat of the invasion of personal space. Even the stanzas in this poem are stacked almost like a building, or you could see that every other stanza has been almost knocked inwards, as though it's been punched inwards. Let's look at the repetition in these poems and what it's saying. It says, a poem is a gesture towards home, implying that a poem is a movement, that it's an active thing. It makes dark demands I call my own. What is authorial intent? What do authors intend you to get from a poem? And is there meaning in there which even the author could see later but didn't consciously put in at the time? So then this is repeated here, and then we have again the repetition at the end of each line. Memory makes demands darker than my own. My last love drove a burgundy car. My first love drove a burgundy car. So the question is this two people, or is the last love also the first love? Or is this again another form of history repeating itself, of this layering? He was fast and awful, tall as my father, steadfast and awful, my tall father, hit hard as a hailstorm. He'd leave marks, like rain hits easy, but leaves its own mark like the sound of a mother weeping again, like the sound of my mother weeping again. The emphasis there is mine, but you can't help but put the emphasis on my when the exact same line is repeated, except this time it becomes personal. And the repetition not only of those two lines, but of the word again, it's double repetition. No sound beating ends where it began. This line is particularly fascinating. So a sound beating would be a good beating. If something's sound, then it is good. But also no sound can be taken on its own as well, as if no one is making any sound when this beating is going on. It has been silenced, has been covered up. But also a sound beating, a good beating. Those two things shouldn't really go together. A beating is not a good thing. So a sound, good place should be your home. But if a beating is taking place in the home, then it throws together that contradiction here. The word beating also has a double meaning because also there are beats to a poem. So we're looking at, again, all of this layering, which is reflected in the structure and the repetition of the poem as a whole. None of the beaten end up how we began. A poem is a gesture towards home. Having the first line, a poem is a gesture towards home, repeated as the last line, shows that each poem is a gesture towards getting towards a safe place that home was not for the narrator beforehand. Each poem is a gesture towards a safe place. Each poem is therapeutic. Each poem helps the poet understand themselves a little bit better. So it reiterates that statement, but it also makes the poem cyclical as well. So we begin again. It repeats itself like the actions in the poem. The next book in the box is this one here, which is The Gravity Wave by Peter Sir, who is an Irish author. And in this, he is meditating on all the things that are important to him, kind of gathering them around him like collectibles and pairing them together, seeing how they interact. And also contemplating time as well. So he's bringing together, for instance, his reading of the Odyssey and how that links in with his daughter starting secondary school. He is carving out all of the quiet spaces and room for thought, which I think makes this collection very calming in itself. And the one that I have picked to dissect is one called The Meadow. You can pause the video here if you would like to read the poem before I start annotating it. This poem, The Meadow, is very playful and also very sad. It is a rewriting of memories, impossible searching for something. And when you look at the fact that it's set across from a poem called Funeral, which implies loss and death, I think the pairing of these poems informs the tone of this particular poem. So this whole poem is a long question. It begins, where is it? And the question mark isn't until the end. So the whole poem is a question to the reader that includes the reader, because it says, where is it? The poem in which we, so implying that the person that the poet is speaking to is the reader. Where is it? The poem in which we walk across a meadow lit by a soul light, afterglow, the burn of recognition spreading. And I love the way this is structured, the way that it's paced. It feels like a stepping, measured stepping. Where is it? The poem in which we walk across a meadow lit. It's that repetition of these IT sounds, which also sounds slightly like the word which as well. It, which, lit. We, again, as I said, bringing in the reader, walk across a meadow lit by soul light. So as if the meadow itself is dark, all these memories are dark, and the only ones who can shed light on these memories are these two people who experienced it. And I love this idea that the subjects of this poem are the ones who are lighting up the scene, that they are bringing the light with them. And as they step forward, more gets revealed, almost like you're seeing things through a headlight. So this first stanza ends, recognition spreading. So the poem is spreading, it's bleeding into the next stanza. As I said, it is shedding light. And it really teases out this scene. It has repetition towards, infinitely towards, not quite believing and hardly daring to breathe. So not revealing a scene, it has this complete anticipation. The narrator doesn't know what's going to be there because they can't find this poem, this memory. So this poem here, The Meadow, is in place of a poem that they can't find. Both the subjects, we both too late to appear into this poem for it to become the poem that was intended. And is that because the memory has gone, because they're waking up, because it's towards the end of the poem? I like that tongue-in-cheek nature. It's like we can't get to the poem because it's the end of the poem. One of us raising a hand, one of us opening. And I love how opening is at the end of the line here, leaving space, implying that openness. The conversation in which everything is forgiven, everything is forgotten. Where is it? That one. Where is it, that one? Where is that particular poem? Where is this particular person? Have they gone? I just think this is a really subtle poem that, as I said, is joyful in many ways, but also very, very sad. The next poetry collection is this one here called Unknown Soldier by Seni Seneviratne. And Seni's father was from Sri Lanka, and then he fought in the Second World War in the Desert War in North Africa in an otherwise all-white platoon. And she has lots of photographs from his time there, many of which are in the back of this book, which are really wonderful to look through. And this collection, it sets out to do something that it knows it can never fully do, but attempts to do anyway, is build a narrative of her father and also the photographer who took these photos, who she doesn't know at all, to build up an image and an idea, several images and ideas of what their time in this war was like. And I just thought it was really, really moving. And then she intersperses these poems with poems about herself thinking about him in this war. So it's not just about his imagined time there. It's a very self-aware book, and I've actually picked one of those poems where she's talking about herself, reflecting, as the poem that I would like to do a close reading of, which is called Silences. Again, you can pause the video here if you would like to read it before I annotate. As I said, she's writing about her father and trying to give narrative to his life, but also writing about the impossibility of doing that because she doesn't have first-hand experience of it, and in many cases doesn't have even the experience of listening to him talking about these memories because he kept quiet about so much of it. He was at war, and she brings in the language and imagery of war into this poem, besieged by his silences. So the silences, the gaps that she has, feel like an attack. So she goes for a walk in the woods. It says, besieged by his silences and pages turning on quiet photographs, her movements turning the pages on quiet photographs become then our movements when we are turning the pages on quiet photographs later. So we are sharing these motions with her. I love the alliteration here to show the measured walking. I walk in waking woodland where. So she's gone for this walk and there's no sound in the forest. Silence can be comforting, but then also this other silence that she has surrounding her father is the opposite of that. And so she's walking through the woods talking about things that are dead and alive and bringing those things together and looking at them side by side. So the beginnings of bluebells, but also the ashes left cool in the fire pit, the fungus on a dying branch. And to reflect silences as well, we have these space between the stanzas which become silent space as well. The open wound left in the earth, again going back to this imagery of war. And then until I step on dead branches for the sake of the noise. And I adore this line. This idea that she's trying to wake up the forest. So on stepping on the dead branches, all the birds that were quiet and hiding, they come out and they sing. And yes, they have fear, but also they are showing that they are alive. And that reflects what she's doing with her father's memories here. I step on dead branches. So she is digging around in these photographs and the memories of her dead father to find what's still alive, what still has things to say. The final book in this seasonal box is After the Formalities by Anthony Anaxaguru. The title poem is a meditation on racism and race science that discusses the author's Cypriot heritage. And the rest of the poems, I'm going to read you the top of the blurb, which I think sums up the other themes in this book. It says, a knife is pulled, an Uber driver is racially abused on the day of the Brexit referendum, a father bathes his son in ice water, a schoolboy drives a drawing pin into a map of the world. There is this hovering threat of violence throughout this collection, discussions on the male body and also the joys of parenthood. And the poem that I've chosen to do a close reading of here is one called Biographer, which I found so incredibly moving, like many of the poems in this book. This poem, Biographer, is quite long, so I'm just going to look at the first page of this poem, and the narrator of this poem is talking about being called about the death of their grandmother, and you can pause the video here to read it before I annotate. The title of this poem is Biographer, and by the end of the poem, which goes over onto the next few pages, you wonder who the biographer is. Is it the poet, or is it the grandmother they are writing about? They called to say it's a matter of days. I've been trying to work out where. In the shower I cried an adult body. It could be I cried an adult body, so a body of water the size of an adult. Like a school of dolphins coming apart. A school, family and education, also going back to body of water, like being a sea, but also a school of dolphins, if they're coming apart, if they are darting away from each other, maybe that's because of a threat or danger. The end of the poem goes back in time and looks at the grandmother waiting in the sunlight, very happy, waiting for the narrator, the poet, to be born. So that's what he wants for her in her last moments on this earth as well. Does she have sunlight? I say, please open every window in that room, almost like his grandmother is a flower. Wheel her to where the light remembers. Let her lay, let her. And I love the repetition of let here, because it emphasizes letting her have what she wants, but also let. If we think about old medical procedures and letting blood, it was a form of healing. So it's like the sunlight can be healing. let her, even without seeing, be still relief. Let her climb, not fall. Nobody wants to fall. Lay her head, a kiss for her feet, prayer. Let her decide. And these sentences here getting shorter and having lots of full stops shows a shortness of breath. So it would imply illness or getting towards the end of your life. But it also might be that the narrator is really upset and can only get out a few words at a time in their grief. I hope that you enjoyed this format, which was a little bit different. If you have any thoughts about the poems that I have shared, please leave them in the comment section down below. And if you would like to know more, you can head over to the Poetry Book Society and find out about all of the books that they've had recently in their seasonal boxes. Thank you very much to the Poetry Society for sponsoring this video. I hope you're all having a great week, and I will speak to you very soon. Lots of bookish love. Bye.